So we're just so happy this evening to have with us another local pastor from Faith Christian Center, a staff pastor, Pastor Michael Sandel, to share a testimony with us. And so we got the crew here waiting with a bib to eat this wonderful spiritual time together, and to have Pastor Mike share a little bit about his life and how God's touched him. And so, Pastor Michael, the stage is yours, sir. The platform is yours. The altar is yours, and go for it.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this testimony. We talk about testimonies. We're talking about what God has done in our lives, the transformation that took place, the demonstration of His power, and just seeing God's hands working behind the scenes. And when I look back in my life, I can see God's hands involved in my growth and bring me to where I'm at today. And I'm going to start out the way Pastor Curtis started out. Just, my name is Michael Sandel. I've been born and raised here in New Bedford. My parents were born in Puerto Rico, so I'm of Puerto Rican descent or Latino. And if you was to tell me 30 years ago that I'd be a pastor at Faith Christian Center, I'd say you were crazy. It's interesting because growing up in New Bedford, I came from a similar culture as Pastor Curtis. We lived in a tenement house. Both my parents were working. I struggled in school. Not because I had any type of learning disability or anything like that, but I just wasn't interested in school. I was interested in having fun and doing the things that everyone else was doing. But I also remember growing up, going to church. When my dad just one day just decided to take us to church, where for a while we weren't going to church at all. And we started going to the International Church of the Nazarene. Some of you might remember Pastor Manny Xavier. And he was our pastor at the time. And we go there, I'd say maybe about 3 or 4 years, and then we sort of just tailed off, and then we stopped going. But I remember about when I was 12 years old, I had a spiritual experience. I had an encounter with God, actually. And I started really searching God, and understand that, at 12 years old, you didn't know too much about God. You heard about God. I knew God, He existed, but I didn't know much about Him. The only way I was able to learn about God was through a catechism book from a neighbor of mine who had one of those books. He had gone to catechism, gone through all the the 9 yards. I forgot the steps that they take. But he happened to have a book, and that's how I learned about God. And it did something to me, because I remember having an experience where I started pretending like I was a preacher. And one of those bureaus that you have in your bedroom, the long bureaus with the mirrors. And I would use one end of the bureau, and that would be my pulpit. And I forced my brother to sit at the other end, and he'd be my only congregation of the church of my bedroom. And so I just began to minister whatever it was I was ministering, just preaching. And little did I know that was a preparation for what God had for me down the road, several years down the road. And it's interesting, too, that during that time, God had given me a vision. And in that vision, I was standing in the street, and behind me was a church. And people would come from all over to come to me for help. And I never knew what that meant, but I always felt that there was something that God had for me down the road. But since we left church, over time, I started drawing away from God and began getting involved in other things. And starting in junior high school, I started getting into drugs, drinking, skipping school, fighting. I would be involved in, there was marijuana, there was uppers, downers, THC, acid, blotter acid, all those types of drugs that I was doing. And I'd be involved with a bunch of friends. At one time when I was in a room with a friend of mine who lived down the end of the block where I lived, we were all in the room, and there was somebody brought some rifles and guns and everything else. And it turned out that somebody had stolen a bunch of guns and rifles and brought it to my friend's house to hold. And I remember sitting in a circle with these guys, and they were playing Russian roulette with one of the handguns. And I tell you, I remember how nervous I was because everyone was taking turns, and somehow I didn't get a turn. And I think it was, I think maybe because his parents walked in and found out what we were doing. And so those are the things that I found myself in. And this went on right through high school. Continue with the drugs, continue with the drinking. I would go to school drunk. I remember going to my first class. Before we go to class, we all get together. We have bottles of liquor. We go to the cemetery on the way to school. We drink, get drunk, then stagger to school. I stagger into my classroom. I was sitting in the front. It was my English class, and my teacher was Mr. McCarthy in the Tan House of New Bedford. And he never bothered me. He never woke me up. He never bothered me. It was at the end of the class, I'd just be passed out to the whole class, and somebody would wake me up, tell me it was time for the next class. So I stagger over to the next class, and that would go on, and I would just barely make it to classes. As far as my grades were concerned, they were just no good at all. And it was like towards the end of the semester where I just started to buckle down, and I just barely made it to the next class. I love sports. And I was always involved in sports. I played sports every season: baseball, basketball, street hockey, football. I played it all. Unfortunately, because my grades were so low, I wasn't able to make the varsity team or the high school teams. I tried out for the football team. I made the team, but I got cut because my grades were low. I tried out for the track team. I made the team, but then got cut. And so, I look back and I kind of regret that. But I wasn't interested in school or anything like that. I just wanted to have some fun and just, so that just continued. I've always had a heart for God, but, at that time I just wasn't ready for it. I sort of just put it up to the side and said, that's somewhere down the road when I get older. So my thing was that at the time when I was a senior, I had planned to go into the Army, and my plans was to go in there and then make it a career, do my 20 years to come back and, and see what happens after that. So I went into the Army, and basic training was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. Because talk about something that can jerk the slack out of you. That's what basic training did for me. It taught me discipline. It taught me character. It taught me teamwork. It taught me a lot about myself. And, you're an 18-year-old going far away from home for the first time. And the only parent that you had was drill sergeants. And that was a scary thing to think about. But they took care of you. They taught you. They challenged you. They stretched you. And that was probably the most difficult challenges I've had at that age. And I remember when I completed the basic training, I felt such pride. I felt a sense of accomplishment. I felt like I had a sense of purpose. And so I went to advanced training to study, to train for my MOS, or the job that I signed up for, which is a combat engineer. And what I did was I learned how to drive bulldozers, front end loaders, graders, all these things, learning how to dig tank ditches, how to build roads and airfields and stuff like that, learn how to arm or disarm a landmine and all these things, building bridges. And that's what I did in the Army for 4 years. But it was interesting because when it was time to go to my permanent duty station, they sent me off to Germany. So I remember going to Frankfurt, and then we started from Frankfurt, and a bunch of us got into a bus. We drove over to about an hour to Karlsruhe, Germany, which is the southern part of Germany, which is where my duty station was going to be for the next 2.5 years. And, I've just come out of a very strict and very, rigid training. And I was just looking forward to some more of that, that type of atmosphere and that environment. But boy, I tell you, I was really surprised and really disappointed, because when I got that night, when we got to my barracks, and the bus pulled up in front of the building that I was supposed to go into and where I was supposed to live for the next 2.5 years, there were ambulances there. There was the military police there. And I'm saying, what is going on? And I was outside with my duffel bag waiting to go in. But before I can go in, they had to bring this guy. They carried out this guy from the building in a stretcher. into the ambulance. Turned out this guy overdosed on heroin, and I come to find out that the barracks that I was in, there was a lot of drugs, there was a lot of addiction, there was a lot of alcoholism. You talk about the discipline that I come out of. I was very disappointed because the place was lax. It was very undisciplined. The enlisted men, they had no respect for their superiors and COs or anything like that. And it was not a very good culture. But unfortunately, I got caught up in the culture, so I got involved in more drugs. I got involved in illegal activities. I was selling drugs. I was involved in black marketing, selling cigarettes and American liquor to the German nationals, making money, womanizing, getting all kinds of women over there. And that's what I did for the 3.5 years that I was out there. And of course, my idea was to make it a career. But at the end of my enlistment, my first 4 years, I was still undecided as to what I wanted to do. So I decided, you know what, at the last minute, I decided not to re-enlist. I was so disappointed with the Army because I was looking forward to a long, disciplined career that's going to help shape me to be a great man. But it was nothing like that. And I got caught up with all that nonsense. So I came back home, stayed in New Bedford for a little while, moved over to Texas for a while to get a job and work there. I was doing okay there, but I was still doing the drugs and the drinking, still doing the partying. I came back, got hooked up with a woman, went in, moved in with her, had a son, lived together for about 3.5 years. It was during that time where things really got bad for me, because I remember how I was out of shape. If there was a picture that was taken of me, and I remember looking at it, and I couldn't believe how much the things that I've done in my life, how it changed me physically. My whole appearance was, I didn't recognize myself, and that scared me. And I began to realize that I couldn't continue down this road, but I didn't know how to get out of it. I was so hooked on my everyday life of drinking and drugs and everything else that I couldn't live a normal everyday life without getting high. Every day I was high. The only time I was not high was I went to work. But when I came home from work, I go to my contacts, knew where to go, get the drugs, do what I had to do, and then spend the rest of the evening just high or drunk. I understand this. All this time that I've been doing drugs and everything else, what I didn't realize was I was looking for something, searching for something. I was searching for meaning. I found that at basic training, and I thought I found it in the Army, but it wasn't to be. So I found myself still searching, but at the same time, there was a big empty hole in me. And it's like I started running my course. I was running out of steam. I was tired of doing the drugs, but I couldn't get out of this vicious cycle that I found myself in. But just to show you how God is and how good God is, how merciful and gracious he is, God had my number. And so God would send certain individuals my way to plant seeds in my heart. One of the persons that he sent was a neighbor who happened to be the aunt of the woman that I was living with. She was the sweetest lady. Her name is Virginia. And she would go to church, and she would go to a Spanish Pentecostal church. She was so faithful and so devout as a Christian. And she was the first Christian that I've ever met that had an impression on me, because I've met so many others that seemed so phony and just didn't seem real to me. But she was real. And she never pushed religion on me. She never preached the gospel to me. She never made me feel condemned. She always was encouraging. Always with, every time she came, it was like she was like what's the expression? A breath of fresh air. And one day she gave me a book to read. And I don't know if you remember the book Armageddon by Hal Lindsey. Anybody ever read that book? I'll tell you, that book, that scared the bejesus out of me. When I read that book, and it's about, the end times out of the book of Revelations. And that really scared me. That was for me an eye-opener, an awakening. It was at that time when I began to wonder and think about God. And I began to start searching on my own. And the moment I started searching, that's when God began to work and move. And one day, this guy just comes knocking at the door one day. He knocks on the door. I answer it. I thought it was some sales guy. Didn't know who he was. He says, I heard that you wanted to know something about Jesus. And I'm saying, I said, well, who in the world told you that? I mean, I know I was searching in my heart, but I don't remember telling anybody this. But he just came knocking in my door, and I said, well, all right. So I let him in. And he spent maybe a couple of hours in my house. And I'll tell you, some of the things he was saying was doing something in my heart. It was like he was sharing the grace and the mercy and forgiveness of God. And at that moment, I really needed to hear it, because I did so many things that I wasn't proud of. I was so involved I was in such a mess that listening to that was like a breath of fresh air. That was for me good news. And so that started something. And there was a couple of guys who were good friends of mine that I went to school with, that I used to party with. We used to party, we used to play cards, we used to drink. I mean, we used to party really hard. But they were married, they had family. We partied so hard that they had to separate themselves from each other and from me, because their wives were not happy and it was affecting their family and everything else. So they knew they had to put a stop to it. So they did. So I didn't see them for about a year. A year later, I ran into them, and I knew that something was different about them. These were not the same guys I used to hang with. These weren't the guys that I used to party with. God had done a transformation in their lives. I can see it in their faces. I can hear it in their voices. God did something in their lives, and they began to talk about how they went back to church, how God has changed their lives, how everything is going well, and I'm listening to these guys. I'm saying I don't recognize these guys. They look this, they sound like Gilly, they sound like Lewis, but they're not the same guys I used to know. And I remember after having that conversation, when we finally parted, I remember saying to God, Lord, I want what they have. I want what they have. If you can do it for them, I know you can do it for me. And after that meeting, they began to reach out to me, inviting me to church. And again, at that time, I still wasn't ready to make that move, but it was like I had one foot in and one foot out. I was still thinking about my responsibility as a father, and trying to get my ex-girlfriend to try to come to church so that we can do the right thing and get married and just settle down and just be a normal family, But that wasn't in the cards, because she didn't want nothing to do with God. As a matter of fact, she didn't want nothing to do with me. But my friends would always continue to come by and pick me up and take me to church whenever I did go, or go to a Bible study whenever I could go. And this went on for a few months. But at the same time, the relationship was getting more toxic and much more difficult. And it was very hard to live in that atmosphere, but I wouldn't let go. Again, my thinking was, if she can get on the same page as me, we can get our acts together and go to church, get married, do the right thing, then we can be a normal family again, because I had a son. And but I wasn't about to leave him. But I knew that in my situation, I was searching for God. I knew that God had to be first place in my life. And I remember one night I was working as a security guard. I was working at the bank. It was the old NBIS bank downtown on the corner of Union and Purchase. I was working there on the third shift. And I remember at that time, that's when I decided I was going to give my life to the Lord. So I go into the president's office, drop to my knees, and I just began to pray and ask God. I was in tears, and I said, Lord, help me. Please help me, Lord God. Come into my life. I want a new life. I want my life to change. I want things to change. I just pray in my heart, just crying out to God. And from that moment on, my life started taking a change. Of course, there was some series of decisions I still had to make, some very difficult decisions to make, like, what do I do with this relationship? What do I do about my son? And I started going to church, to the Nazarene church. I started going back there, and the youth pastor that was there pulled me aside and told me that, I had to make some decisions. I had to let go and move out of the house and not worry about her. God will take care of her. And, I wasn't willing to do that. I just kept hanging on, hoping that God will come in and step in and change things. And at the same time, too, that when I did give my life to the Lord, I stopped doing drugs. And here's what's interesting, because I started to give my life to the Lord, the devil did not want to let me go. It was a time where I was still doing drugs, and I was on the verge of making that decision to follow Christ. Um, and at that time, it was a dry spell. There was no drugs at all, nowhere around. I'd go to all my contacts. No one had anything. So I said, okay, well, this is going to be pretty easy. So the moment I made my decision, all of a sudden started getting phone calls. Hey, Mike, we got some good stuff here. Hey, Mike, this came in and stuff, and it's like, oh my goodness, now I'm being pulled back in the other direction. I said, well, wait a minute, I just made a decision here, and now all of a sudden there's drugs, and but I stood my ground. I said, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this change. I had guys, my friends, come by to the house and say, hey, listen, I got some good stuff, try it. And there was one time I almost came close to doing it, almost came close to saying, okay, let me try it. But I said, no. I said, I won't do it. So I said, thank God I was able to overcome that. I stopped the drinking. The last thing was smoking cigarettes, which was the hardest thing for me to do. But as I continued to start going to church and making a decision, and as a matter of fact, I tell the story all the time, but I have to go back to it again. But the day that I decided to make a decision to leave that apartment and move into my own place, by doing that, I'm leaving my girlfriend, I'm leaving my son and going on my own, which means I'm not going to see my son every day. That was a hard transition for me, because I've always worried about somebody stepping in and being a father to my son or being an influence to my son. And I didn't want that. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to let go. And it took me a year before I made that decision to let go. And at that time I was saved. I made it, I was already going to church and hoping that she would follow suit, but she didn't. And then we decided it was time to split up. I decided to move out, and she went to New York, gave me some time to pack some things. But before I did that, I went to Boston to see Jimmy Swaggart. I don't know if anybody remember when Jimmy Swaggart came down to Boston years ago, to the Boston Garden, the old Boston Garden. And it was jam-packed. And I remember having 2 packs of cigarettes, packs of Cools. And again, I had been trying to quit smoking for the longest time, and that was the last hurdle. And then there was something that Jimmy Swaggart said, and I couldn't tell you what it was, but I knew that something inside snapped, something changed, that I knew that cigarette smoking, that habit, was broke. When we left the Boston Garden, the pack of Cools that I had in my pocket, I threw it in the trash, and from that day on, I never picked up a cigarette again. Didn't get up in the morning, didn't have any desire for cigarettes. To me, that was amazing, because I know how much I struggled with, of trying to quit smoking. And I listened to Pastor Curtis's story. He had the same issue as well. And I would do all kinds of things to try to quit. I would take the cigarettes and I snap them in half and throw them in the trash. Then I started getting that desire. Go back in the trash and tape the cigarettes back together again and try to smoke it. If there was some cigarette butts, I'd go get some cigarette butts. I'll whatever, just to fulfill that desire. But when I made that decision after Jimmy Swaggart spoke a word, that word dropped in my spirit. It broke that habit, and I did not have a desire since then. And I tell you, it was all God. And this is how God was really working in my life. And of course, helping me with this decision to move out, and then having to deal with the fact that I can only see my son on weekends. I can see him anytime I wanted to, but the weekends was the time when I can have him with me. But even that became complicated, and the relationship that we once had with this ex-girlfriend turned into a very toxic relationship. She did everything to try to use me. She would talk bad about me. She always give me a hard time trying to see my son. When I wanted to see my son, she would not let me unless I do things for her or buy things. And she was just doing everything to use me. And she made my life miserable. Guys, I got to tell you, she made my life miserable. And you talk about being a young Christian. And I remember one time when I went to go pick up my son, I was doing good. and I went to go pick him up, and she knew exactly how to push my button. She knew which button to push to set me off, because I used to have a temper. I mean, it took a lot to get mad, but she always knew just which button to push to get me really riled up. And one day she pushed the right button, and I got so riled up, I reverted back to my old ways. I swore, I cursed, and as I was doing all that, I just saw her standing there with a smirk in her mouth. And I knew that smirk was what that smirk was. It's almost as if she was saying, I got you. You're supposed to be a Christian, and look at you. You're not a Christian. You're still the same old person. When I left that place, man, left that house. I got into the car. I broke down and cried. I mean, I just wept. I mean, that weep came from within, because I realized that I disappointed God. And I said, Lord, I'll never disappoint you again like that. I'll never let it get to me like that. And it took a lot. And the thing that God helped me with was, when you're dealing with someone that you would imagine yourself sneaking into her house with a hood over your head, where she won't recognize you, and then just choking her until she turned blue, and then letting her go, and then trying it again, and those are thoughts that were coming in my head, because that's how much anger and hate I had for her. And when I was around her, I get all tense because I was ready for a fight, because it seemed like we were always getting into an argument. And the one scripture that and again, I'm still new as a Christian, but I'm spending more time in the Word. And in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus said, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you. That would play over and over and over in my mind. And I realized that's what I needed to do with this woman. And guys, it wasn't the easiest thing, but there was one point where I finally realized, okay, if I continue doing it my own way, it's not going to happen. It's just going to continue. I'm going to continue getting upset. It's just going to get me all riled up again. So I stopped doing that. I stopped doing the opposite. I started doing the opposite. So when she called and start trouble, I just listen, won't say a word. I remember the words of Jesus: bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you. I would pray for her, sometimes with grit teeth. I would say to her, okay, Sarah, okay, I hear you. God bless you. I'll pray for you. And I love you. And I'll say all those things, And that was not easy, but I continued doing that. Sometimes I slip up, but then I would continue down that path, because that's what God said. And if God said that, then I've got to do it. And over time, and I'm talking about years, because this relationship, this tension that we had sort of spilled over into my marriage. It sort of hampered my marriage. And here I am in the middle, I'm trying to please two people, and it was very hard because they both be mad at me. And so I didn't know what to do. And so I was just crying out to God for wisdom. I said, Lord, I don't know what to do here. So finally I had to make some choices. I said, okay, you know what? My wife she's my wife. She has to come first place. And I have to keep it that way. I need to keep her happy. So, and I started doing that. And I'll tell you, years later, I get a call. It was from this woman, my ex-girlfriend, who gave me a hard time for years. Called and said, Mike, I wanted to apologize to you for for the things I've done, for the way I've treated you. I've used you. I said some bad things about you. And I just wanted to call and just tell you, I'm sorry. I apologize. She not only apologized to me, but she apologized to my wife. And since that time, we become good friends.
Wow.
And whenever there was a function, of course, again, she's the mother of my son. Whenever there's a function, a birthday party, I'd be there. We'd sit across and talk to each other and laughing as if we never had a past. And just to show you how God can really mend a relationship and heal the relationship. But it really tested my faith and my fortitude, because I had to really trust in God, because, when you get in the flesh, you start acting like your old self again, and you don't want to do that. But sometimes, you find yourself in a situation where you fall into that trap. But I thank the Lord for helping me through that, because I was still a young Christian. I was growing. I was still developing. And but God was able to help me overcome that. And now we're great friends. We're not enemies anymore. We're not bitter enemies. We can still talk, and we can still, just be cordial with one another, even friendly. And that's all God. And so, my journey as a Christian, growing and developing. And I remember when I first got saved, I finally found the purpose and the meaning that I've been looking for all of my life. Drugs didn't do it. Drinking didn't do it. Women didn't do it. Relationship didn't do it. Partying didn't do it. None of that did it. But when I found Christ, he filled that void. He gave me meaning and purpose, because that's all I needed. That's all I was looking for. And so I remember I was so on fire for the things of God. I love being in church. I wanted to be in church every day, because from the Nazarene church, I went over to Pastor Curtis's church. At that time, I don't even know if Pastor Curtis was even there, but this was like during the mid-'80s. And so he may have been there. I just never knew who he was. But I remember attending that church for a little while. At that time, it was taken over by another pastor. And I began to follow that pastor. And that's when I began to learn about the word of faith. And that really helped me to build up my faith. And I remember when we finally established a church in New Bedford, I got involved in every area of ministry. You talk about training. I got all the training I can get in the church. I learned something about youth ministry, children's ministry, street ministry. I was involved in prison ministry. I did Bible studies. I taught new members class. I was doing the sound system. I was doing cleaning the building, moving furniture, and all this other stuff. But I loved it. I loved it because it meant doing something for God. It meant working for the Lord. I didn't have to have a title. I was just happy just serving God. That's all that for me, that was all I needed to do. And I felt like I was actually doing something for the Lord, even if it means going to the building, being the first one to unlock the doors, or sweeping, or shoveling snow, cleaning the bathrooms. I didn't mind it. I just loved doing it because I was just so on fire for God. And it was during that time when I started getting a real sense in my heart of a call in my life. And it was interesting. There was a scripture in the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26, 27. I always refer to this verse because it's me, where the Bible says that God chooses the foolish things of this world to confound the mighty. The wise. And he says, and God has chosen the weak things of this world to confound the mighty. The Amplified Version said that God deliberately chose the foolish things and the weak things of this world, because the scripture goes on to say, so that no one can boast about anything that they've done. Because if you're going to boast in anything, you're going to boast in the Lord, because he's the one that did it all. And I know that I always consider myself insignificant. I always, felt like I felt inadequate. I never really felt like God really, really wasn't anybody special. So I consider myself one of the weaks. I consider myself among the foolish that God had chosen. And I'm not an educated man. All I know is that I had a heart to serve, and I love people. But that was something that God put in my heart. And it's interesting how God had really put me in situations where I dealt with people and and got some experience in ministry and learned something about serving. And it wasn't until I came to Faith Christian Center where God began to open up some doors. And again, never in my wildest dream that I ever thought about being a pastor at Faith Christian Center. And again, I was just happy just to serve. But I also knew that there was a call in my life, and I would often remind myself of the vision that God had given me several years ago when I was about 12 years old. And I knew that somehow there was a connection there, but I didn't know how it was going to come to pass. But again, you see God's hand working. And so as I went to Faith Christian Center, I became a new converts worker, an altar call worker. I became a care group leader, a small groups leader. Then I was asked by Pastor Sam, the founding pastor at the time, to be an elder in the church. For me, that was like, wow, that was what an honor that was. I said, but as a matter of fact, when he took me out to dinner, my wife and I, he asked me to become an elder, and I thought he was joking. I said, "You're joking, right?" I was getting ready to laugh. I was waiting for the punchline, but there was no punchline because that's exactly, he wanted me to be one of his elders. I said, "Wow, okay." And I'm thinking, but who am I to be an elder? What have I done? I mean, I've got no schooling. I've got no Bible training or anything like that. I mean, all I know is what I know from serving God in the church. But he asked me to, and I did, and I served as faithful as I could. And then he asked me to do a new members class. I taught spiritual authority class. I even taught the School of Ministry, which I attended for 2 years there. And then one day, when I was teaching a new members class, which was on a Monday night, and Ron, I don't know if were you teaching with me on Monday night? I can't hear you.
Yeah, you gotta unmute.
You gotta put your
Unmute yourself, Ron.
unmute yourself.
There you go.
I still can't hear you.
I got it. I got
Okay.
it. Sorry,
you
I'm
go.
using my iPad. I'm not used to where everything's in a different place. No, I don't think I was with you then. I only taught with you a few times when there was a transition and I needed somebody to fill in.
Okay, all right.
But I
Well-
did learn from you. I listened to all the tapes over and over and over and over before I ever taught a lesson.
Well, it was there Monday nights at the time when we were doing it, because then eventually you took over, and it was on a Monday night.
Right.
And I would like to go early, an hour early, so I go and pray and set everything up and everything else. But every time I would pray, every time I go in, I walk through the sanctuary to get to the fellowship hall. But I would walk through the sanctuary. All of a sudden, I began to envision myself behind the pulpit.
Mm.
And I said, okay, wait a minute. It says, this would happen every time I go in on a Monday evening in preparation for new members class. And I would actually see myself behind. And at first I thought it was just me, just imagining and, wishful thinking. But this continued on and to the point where I can actually see myself, where it was actually real. It was a vision that was real. But I said, okay, Lord, if that's the case, how's that going to happen? No one's ever mentioned to me about it. And it seemed like everyone else is, they have all the pastors they need. I don't see any room here. I don't see how that's going to happen. But I didn't know. But I continued doing what I was doing, continued, working and serving as I've always done. And it wasn't until 3 years later when that vision actually came to pass. When Pastor Dave, at that time was the lead pastor, he asked me out to lunch. And when I went out to lunch with him, I thought he was going to sort of reprimand me, because at that time my 2 boys were going through youth ministry. During the youth, they were at youth, and they did something stupid. And so, I got reprimanded them and spoke to them, and the youth pastor pulled them aside, and we all spoke and everything else. But somehow I thought Pastor Dave got wind of that. So I'm saying, okay, now he's going to talk to me. He's going to lecture me about having control of my boys. And, if you want to be in ministry, you have to be able to control your household. And to be honest with you, I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to be lectured. I didn't want to hear it. But I said, well, you know what? I got to go. And so that morning I prayed and I said, Lord, if he's going to reprimand me, then please help me to receive it. Don't let me get offended. Don't let me get upset. Just let me receive it, and just help me to build the character that you want me to have. So as I was praying, all of a sudden I heard this voice telling me, he's going to ask you to come on staff. And I said, no, that can't be right. That can't be right. I just continued praying. Again, that voice came and says, I want you to come on staff. I said, what? He wants it. I said, what? I said, okay, well, I put it off to the side, met him that afternoon, had lunch, did some small talk, and I'm just getting ready for him to let me have it. And then that's when he asked me, we'd like for you to come on staff. He said, this is not something we just decided to do. We've been talking and praying about this for the last 3 years. We've been watching you, observing you, and all this other stuff. And we feel that you're the right person for the position. And it was everything that God has shown me several years ago about being in a position, in a place, strategically placed, where people will come, where I can help them. And but see, again, I'm almost amazed when I look back and I see the series of events that took place in my life, how he took me from a life of drugs, drinking, womanizing, partying, and then finally send people my way to begin to deposit seeds into my life that and to allow me to turn to God. God got my attention because I was spiraling downhill real fast, and I was not in a good place. I was not proud of myself. I was not happy with myself. I was not happy where I was. And if you know what it feels like to feel hopeless, feeling hopeless is probably the worst place to be. And that's what I was feeling, that hopelessness. And I hated that feeling, but I didn't know how to overcome that. But God knew. And because he had a call in my life, and the scripture says that the calling of God is without repentance. The gifts and calling of God that he has in our lives, he doesn't change his mind. It's irrevocable. You know, God will not take it away. The only one that will prevent that from happening is us. God will call you, but God will not make you answer the call. That's something that you and I are going to have to do. But it's going to take surrendering. And that's what I've done all throughout my life, was surrender. And every time I surrendered, God was able to take me to the next level. But to get to that place is always a challenge, because you're dealing with the flesh. You're dealing with the circumstances outside of you. You're dealing with other people, and they can be the biggest hindrances in your life, preventing you from getting to where God wants you to be. And listen, guys, I'm not a fancy person. I'm not, I don't consider myself holier than thou. I'm just a regular, everyday person with flaws, just like everybody else. But God chose the foolish things of this world so that he can confound the wise. And he chose the weak things of this world to confound the mighty, so that no one would boast. And I have no reason to boast in myself, because I've come to this place not on my own. It was all God. I never sought for the position. As a matter of fact, I never sought for any position when I came to Faith Christian Center. The doors just opened for me to step in, and I was the one that was being approached. So will you come and do this? And I would just say yes. I never said no to anything. I would always say yes. Whatever they asked me to do, I did it. Even though I may not know how to do it, even though I never done it before, but because of the training I've had over the years, I've learned to serve. And if there's any lesson to learn here, is being a servant and being faithful in the little things that God has placed you. And if you show yourself faithful in those areas, the skies are the limit. God can trust you in some bigger things. And I just thank God for bringing me to that place. And, and now I've been pastoring here at Faith Christian Center going on 16 years. And I look back, and I'm still at awe, because I says, Lord, I mean, the fact that you found me worthy to be a pastor here, even though I don't consider myself worthy, and I'm surrounded by some great men of God that I can learn and look up to, and really have my back, and has really taught me some things. And I'm still learning some things, guys. I haven't gotten to that place where I would like to be, but I feel that God is not done with me either. And I think that's probably the beauty of it, is because how God is able to transform my life, saving me from myself, and putting me in a position to make difficult decisions by stepping out in faith and trusting in him. And because I was able to trust him, God was able to take me further. And he's taking me further than I ever imagined he would take me. And I just want to encourage you guys, listen, if you trust God and show yourself faithful, there's no telling what you're able to do, what will have you do, whatever down the road. And never shortchange God, and never put God in a box in your life, because I like what Pastor Curtis said. He said he was 60 years old. I'm 62, going on 63. And Pastor Curtis says there's still some things he wants to do. He wants to write books and everything else. And, he wants to go back to school and get his bachelor's degree. I commend him for that, because that tells me that's a man who hasn't stopped living. That's a man who believes that God is not done with him. And, I want to have that same attitude too. I don't want to just do my time and then retire. I want to continue to do my time until God says it's time to go home, But You know, guys, I mean, that's the gist of it. You know, God has brought me some places, and I tell you, there's some hairy situations that I've put myself in when I was in Germany. One of the things they tell you over there was that when you first go there is they tell you, you know, certain places that to avoid. Um, and also, if he says if you do something illegal and you get arrested by the German nationals, then you're on your own, because then you're going to spend your jail time in Germany, and we can't do anything about it. And I've done some things, some illegal things, some illegal activities in the cities of Germany, and I put myself in a situation where I could have gotten arrested. And somebody was praying for me. Somebody was praying for me. But and here's the thing: God knew where He wanted to take me, but He knew what He needed to take me out of before He can get me to that place. And God has taken me out of some hairy situations, some bad relationships, some bad choices and decisions that I made that you know that set me back. And you know, I have regrets. You know, I mean, I look back and I have regrets, but you know what? God has a way of turning things around. And you know, Steve, you said it also in Romans 8:28. You know how God's able to work all things for your good. You know, and just God took all of my messes and somehow put it together and worked it out so that it can work out good for me. And I just thank God. And that is the epitome of God's grace and mercy. You know, I cannot say that enough. And I like what Paul says. He said, God counted me worthy to be called into the ministry. And I say the same thing. God counted me worthy. And it was by His grace and mercy. And that I'm where I'm at today. And I'm humbled by that. And I never want to think of myself more highly than I ought to, because I know where I came from. And I know that without Him, I can't do anything. I can't accomplish anything. I can't even tie my own shoes without Him. And so I thank God that every step I rely on Him to get me through the difficult challenges that I face down the road. And I just thank God that He's been so faithful to me. But I mean, that's it.